On July 12, 2026, U.S. Central Command posted a single blunt statement on social media that read, "The Strait of Hormuz is open to all vessels seeking to lawfully transit the international waterway. U.S. forces are positioned and prepared to ensure that freedom of navigation remains available despite unwarranted Iranian aggression, harassment, threats, and arbitrary declarations." Iran does not control the strait. Traffic is flowing. Attached to that post was a graphic showing over 800 ships, and more than 400 million barrels of crude oil had transited the strait over the previous 2 months, with more than 140 of those ships passing through in just the previous 7 days alone. Numbers that stood in stark, direct contrast to everything Iran's own military spokespeople had been claiming publicly right up until that same week. That's not a vague claim of progress. That's CENTCOM putting an exact, verifiable, publicly posted number on a waterway that, just months earlier, had been effectively shut down entirely by Iranian mines, missile boats, and repeated deadly attacks on commercial shipping. So today we're breaking down exactly how the United States actually pulled that number off. What specific operation caught Iran's Revolutionary Guard so far off guard that its own naval presence in the Gulf of Oman reportedly dropped from 11 ships to 0 within 48 hours? And why, despite that CENTCOM statement, Iran is still publicly insisting the strait remains closed on its own terms, a contradiction that turns out to be far more revealing than either side's official statement alone would suggest. Let's start with how this crisis actually began, because the scale of what the U.S. eventually did to reopen this waterway only makes sense once you understand exactly how completely Iran had shut it down in the first place, and how deliberately that closure was carried out from the very first hours of this war. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched surprise airstrikes across Iran, hitting military and government sites, and, in the opening hours of that campaign, killing Supreme Leader Ali Khamenei, along with several other senior Iranian officials. Iran's response was immediate and specific. It moved to block the Strait of Hormuz entirely, issuing warnings forbidding passage, boarding and attacking merchant ships, and laying naval mines throughout the waterway. Before this war, roughly a quarter of the entire world's seaborne oil trade and about a fifth of the planet's liquefied natural gas moved through that single stretch of water. Once Iran shut it down, the impact was immediate and global, triggering what's now referred to as a full-blown global fuel crisis, with shipping firms suspending operations there almost entirely rather than risk their vessels and crews. The human cost mounted quickly too. Over the following months, at least one tugboat was sunk, 17 merchant ships were damaged, 7 of which had to be abandoned entirely, 2 merchant ships were captured outright by Iranian forces, 12 seafarers were killed or went missing, and a port worker in Bahrain was killed with 2 more wounded in a related attack. This wasn't a diplomatic standoff playing out through statements and sanctions. It was an active, lethal campaign against international commercial shipping. So the United States responded with its own dedicated military campaign specifically built around reopening that waterway. On March 19th, the U.S. Air Force, Navy, and the Israeli Air Force began a sustained aerial campaign against Iranian targets, explicitly announced as part of a plan to destroy the Iranian naval vessels and drones that were actively targeting shipping in the strait. As part of that early campaign, Israel assassinated Alireza Tangsiri, the Iranian naval officer specifically overseeing the blockade operation itself. That's worth sitting with for a moment because it tells you exactly how targeted this campaign was from the very beginning. This wasn't broad, indiscriminate pressure on Iran as a whole. It was a deliberate effort to remove the specific individual responsible for coordinating the blockade, a decapitation strike aimed squarely at the operational command structure keeping the strait closed. Around this same period, the pressure campaign wasn't limited to military strikes alone. The U.S. Treasury Department announced it was revoking a prior authorization, referred to as Iran-related General License X, and replacing it with a new license specifically covering the revocation and wind-down of an earlier authorization that had permitted the production, delivery, and sale of Iranian crude oil, petrochemical products, and petroleum products. That's a deliberately technical, bureaucratic-sounding move, but its practical effect was to close off a financial pathway Iran had been relying on, tightening the economic vice at the exact same time American forces were tightening the physical one around the strait itself. It's also worth noting an incident that added to the tension in the skies over the Gulf during the same window. CENTCOM reported downing an Iranian drone that it said had aggressively approached the USS Abraham Lincoln, continuing to fly directly toward the carrier, despite what American forces described as clear de-escalatory measures being taken to warn it off. That kind of encounter, an Iranian drone pressing an approach on a U.S. carrier despite repeated warnings, is exactly the sort of incident that could have spiraled into something much larger, and the fact that it didn't, that it ended with the drone being downed rather than triggering a broader immediate escalation, says something about how carefully both sides were managing the edges of this conflict, even while fighting it aggressively at its center. Even as this military pressure campaign was unfolding, small diplomatic signals kept surfacing in parallel, reminders that this conflict has never been purely a straight line of escalation without any countervailing gestures. On July 15th, President Trump announced on Truth Social that Iran had released an American citizen who had been wrongfully detained in the country since December of 2024, writing that the individual was now safely outside Iran and in good condition, and describing the release as a gesture of goodwill on Iran's part. That announcement landed in the same general window as the strikes against Iran's coastal defenses and small boat fleet, which is a useful reminder that even during the most intense phases of direct military confrontation, both governments have continued finding narrow channels for smaller, lower-stakes gestures that keep some thread of engagement alive. It doesn't erase or offset the scale of the military confrontation happening around it, but it does complicate the picture of this as a conflict defined purely by uninterrupted escalation, with absolutely no room for anything else happening alongside it. By April 13th, after diplomatic talks in Islamabad had failed to produce any resolution to the broader war, the United States escalated further, imposing a full naval blockade on Iran itself, turning the standoff into a two-way siege where neither side's ships could move freely. On April 23rd, President Trump gave a more specific order directly to the Navy: destroy any Iranian boats caught actively laying mines in the strait, a rules of engagement shift that made clear the U.S. wasn't just going to defend against Iranian attacks reactively anymore. It was going to actively hunt and eliminate the mine-laying capability at its source. On May 3rd, Trump publicly stated that the U.S. would help free up ships still stuck in the strait. And just days later, U.S. forces launched what was called Operation Project Freedom, a short, intense burst of activity running from May 4th through May 6th, specifically aimed at clearing a path for stranded commercial traffic. And by early March, in one of the more remarkable public statements of the entire conflict, Trump had already told reporters that, in his words, the war is very complete, pretty much, claiming Iran's military had been destroyed and the strait had reopened, while also floating the idea of the United States actually seizing control of the waterway from Iran outright. That statement, made so early relative to everything that followed, turned out to be premature, but it does tell you that reopening Hormuz wasn't treated as a secondary objective of this war. At various points, American leadership talked about it as close to the primary one. Now let's get into what actually happened in mid-July, because this is where the operation that genuinely caught Iran off guard took place. And it's a story that requires understanding both the American side and Iran's own public account of it, since the two versions diverge sharply on intent even while agreeing on most of the physical details. According to Iran's own state media, on the night of Tuesday, July 14th, 2 oil tankers attempted to leave what Iranian officials described as the unsafe southern road of the strait after being, in their words, prompted by American aircraft. One of those tankers reportedly caught fire, and both vessels quickly reversed course. A separate IRGC Navy statement issued the following Monday described a similar but distinct incident. 2 supertankers that had switched off their navigation systems and ignored repeated warnings from what Iran calls its Hormuz Strait Security Control Center, attempting to cross what Tehran describes as mined waters, only to be struck and disabled by IRGC forces. Iran's framing of these events was consistent and pointed. It accused the United States of deliberately inciting or misleading these tankers into crossing restricted, mined shipping lanes, essentially using commercial vessels as unwitting pawns to either map Iran's minefields, provoke an Iranian response that could be used to justify further American strikes, or both at once. Whether or not you accept Iran's framing of American intent behind those specific incidents, and it's worth being clear that this characterization comes directly from Iranian state media and the IRGC itself, rather than from independently verified reporting, the pattern those incidents fit into is unmistakable once you look at what CENTCOM actually did in direct response. Citing earlier Iranian strikes on vessels transiting the strait, U.S. Central Command reported striking Iranian air defense systems, command and control networks, coastal radar sites, anti-ship missile capabilities, and more than 60 Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps small boats in and around the strait, all explicitly described as an effort to degrade Iran's ability to continue attacking international commerce. Read that list again slowly, because it's not a random assortment of targets. Air defense systems, command and control networks, coastal radar, anti-ship missiles, and the small fast boats that had been harassing tankers for months. That's a complete, systematic dismantling of every single layer Iran had built to enforce its blockade, executed in a coordinated strike package, rather than as scattered, isolated hits. It's worth understanding why hitting exactly those 5 categories together, air defense, command and control, coastal radar, anti-ship missiles, and small boats, produces such an outsized effect compared to hitting any one of them in isolation. Coastal radar is what actually gives Iranian forces the ability to see an approaching tanker or an incoming strike package in the first place. Command and control networks are what let that radar picture actually get turned into a decision and an order passed down to whichever unit is closest to respond. Anti-ship missiles and small fast boats are the actual weapons that carry out an attack once that order arrives. And air defense is what's supposed to protect all three of those other layers from being destroyed before they can do their job. Take out any single one of those pieces, and the rest of the system can often still limp along, rerouting around the gap. But hit all five simultaneously in a single coordinated operation, and you don't just damage a blockade, you effectively blind, deafen, and disarm the entire enforcement apparatus at once, leaving whatever boats and missile batteries survive with no radar picture to work from, no command structure to receive orders through, and no protective air defense screen to operate safely under. That's the military logic behind why this specific strike package produced results as dramatic as an 11-0 collapse in Iranian naval presence within 48 hours, when months of more scattered incremental strikes against individual boats and missile sites hadn't managed to fully suppress Iran's ability to keep threatening shipping. And the results of that specific operation are what genuinely seem to have caught the IRGC unprepared, based on CENTCOM's own numbers. According to Central Command, 2 days before that strike package, Iran had 11 ships positioned in the Gulf of Oman. 2 days later, Iran had 0. 11 ships to 0 in a matter of 48 hours. CENTCOM's own public statement afterward put it plainly. Freedom of navigation has underpinned American and global economic prosperity for more than 80 years. U.S. forces will continue to defend it. That 11-0 collapse is the single clearest piece of evidence that this wasn't a symbolic show of force. It was a strike package specifically engineered to remove Iran's actual physical naval presence from a key stretch of water almost entirely, and it appears to have done exactly that within an extremely short window. Iran's own retaliation to that strike gives you a sense of just how significant Tehran considered it. The IRGC announced that it had responded by striking what it called 85 separate locations tied to important U.S. military facilities across Bahrain and Kuwait, while Iran's parliamentary speaker went on record making his own claims about the exchange. That's a large, sweeping, retaliatory claim, and it tells you the strike against Iran's small boats, radar sites, and command networks wasn't treated by Tehran as a minor skirmish. It was treated as a strike serious enough to warrant a retaliation described in the scale of dozens of separate targets. And it's worth noting that even a retaliatory claim of that size didn't come with any indication that Iran had managed to reconstitute the naval presence it had just lost in the Gulf of Oman, suggesting the damage to its actual physical enforcement capability along the strait itself remained largely intact even after Tehran's own counterpunch. Layer on top of that, the broader economic squeeze the United States had already been running against Iran throughout this same period, because the July strike package didn't happen in isolation from the rest of the pressure campaign. The naval blockade the U.S. imposed back on April 13th has been estimated, according to U.S. figures, to be costing Iran roughly $500 million a day. Under that blockade, American forces reportedly intercepted 85 separate vessels attempting to move in or out of Iranian ports, while shipping trackers at Lloyd's List separately estimated that 26 vessels managed to bypass the blockade successfully despite that enforcement effort. 3 ships were seized outright. Iran, in turn, seized 2 cargo ships of its own in a retaliatory move. So by the time the mid-July strike package hit Iran's coastal defenses and small boat fleet, Tehran was already bleeding roughly $500 million daily from the blockade alone, on top of losing its actual naval and coastal defense capability along the strait itself. That combination, financial hemorrhaging plus a sudden near-total collapse of its physical enforcement presence, is what made this specific moment feel like such a turning point, rather than just another exchange of strikes in an already long-running conflict. It's worth stepping back and putting a dollar figure on what all of this actually meant for the rest of the world during the months the strait was effectively shut down, because the consequences didn't stay contained to the Gulf itself. With roughly a quarter of the world's seaborne oil trade and about a fifth of global liquefied natural gas normally moving through that single waterway, the closure triggered exactly the kind of global fuel crisis you'd expect, pushing energy prices higher across markets that had nothing directly to do with the war itself, and forcing shipping companies worldwide to either absorb dramatically higher insurance costs to keep sailing the direct route or reroute entirely around the southern tip of Africa, adding weeks to voyages and burning enormously more fuel in the process. That's exactly why CENTCOM's July statistics, 800 ships, 400 million barrels, 140 vessels in a single week, carried so much weight the moment they were published. Those weren't just military bragging points. They were a direct signal to global energy markets that the single biggest source of supply-side uncertainty in the world economy might finally be easing, which is precisely the kind of news that shipping insurers, oil traders, and government energy planners across dozens of countries had been waiting months to hear. There's also a parallel diplomatic and administrative track running alongside all of this military pressure, because the United States wasn't just trying to force the strait open through firepower alone. Alongside the military campaign, there's been an effort described as the formation of a Persian Gulf Strait Authority, a structure aimed at establishing some kind of longer-term coordinated framework for managing security and passage through the waterway going forward, rather than leaving its status permanently contested between American naval enforcement and Iranian claims of sovereign control. That effort matters because it points toward an eventual goal beyond simply winning individual tactical exchanges. The United States appears to be trying to build something more durable, an actual governance structure for the strait, rather than assuming that periodic strikes against Iranian boats and radar sites alone will keep the waterway open indefinitely once American attention inevitably shifts elsewhere. Now here's where the story gets genuinely complicated, and it's the part that deserves the most honest, careful treatment. Because CENTCOM's declaration that the strait is open and Iran's continued insistence that it remains closed are not just two spun versions of the same basic reality. They reflect two fundamentally different definitions of what open actually means. On the American side, the metric is concrete and measurable. Hundreds of ships transiting, hundreds of millions of barrels moving, real commercial traffic flowing at a pace approaching pre-crisis levels. On the Iranian side, the IRGC has continued issuing direct, explicit statements insisting the strait will not reopen as long as what it calls U.S. Threats and interference in the region persist, describing the waterway as, in its own words, our territory, and declaring that no outsider who has traveled thousands of kilometers to interfere will be allowed to do so. One senior IRGC commander put it even more starkly earlier in the conflict, warning that the decision to fully close the strait rests with what he called the establishment's top leadership, adding, "I, as a soldier, say that we are ready to do it whenever the order is issued." That's not the language of a force that considers itself defeated or sidelined. It's the language of a military organization that has absorbed serious losses along this specific stretch of water, but still considers itself the ultimate arbiter of whether the waterway stays open or shut, regardless of how many tankers CENTCOM's own statistics show currently moving through it. So how do you reconcile 800 ships and 400 million barrels of crude moving through the strait with an Iranian military that's still publicly threatening to set ships ablaze and insisting it retains ultimate control over the waterway? The most honest answer is that both things are true simultaneously, and that tension is exactly what makes this moment in the conflict so unstable. The United States has clearly measurably degraded Iran's physical capacity to enforce a full blockade, destroying dozens of small boats, entire radar networks, air defense systems, and command infrastructure in a matter of days, and pushing Iran's naval presence in a key stretch of the Gulf of Oman from 11 vessels down to 0 almost overnight. That's real, substantial, verifiable military success. But degrading a capability is not the same thing as eliminating an intention. And Iran has shown throughout this entire war that even after suffering severe losses, it retains both the willingness and, at least periodically, the residual capability to strike isolated targets of opportunity, whether that's a tanker that strays off the officially sanctioned safe corridor, a vessel that switches off its navigation system, or a ship that ignores warnings from Iran's own self-declared security control center, the strait being functionally open to the overwhelming majority of traffic, while remaining genuinely dangerous for any vessel that deviates from the specific, narrow, heavily monitored routes the U.S. and its partners have secured is a very different and much more fragile kind of open than the pre-war status quo, where the entire waterway was simply safe by default. That fragility is exactly why the specific tanker incidents from mid-July matter so much, regardless of whose account of American intent you find more credible. 2 tankers, on 2 separate nights within roughly a week of each other, ended up damaged or disabled after deviating from the established safe corridor. Iran's explanation is that American forces deliberately provoked or misled those vessels into doing so. An alternative, equally plausible explanation is that these were simply commercial vessels, making navigational decisions, whether out of confusion, mechanical issues, or an attempt to save time and fuel by avoiding the longer designated safe route, and that Iran's mines and IRGC forces were simply lying in wait for exactly this kind of deviation, regardless of what specific American aircraft happened to be operating nearby at the time. Untangling which explanation is closer to the truth is genuinely difficult from the outside, and it's worth resisting the temptation to fully accept either government's framing without skepticism. What's not in dispute is the outcome. Vessels that leave the sanctioned corridor in this specific stretch of water are still, months into this reopening campaign, running a real risk of being struck. Let's talk about what this specific strategy actually reveals about how the United States has approached this entire reopening campaign, because there's a clear evolution visible across the timeline we've walked through. In the earliest phase, back in March and April, the emphasis was on broad military pressure. An aerial campaign against Iranian naval and drone capability generally, followed by a full blockade of Iranian ports as a form of reciprocal pressure. That approach produced incremental progress, but clearly wasn't sufficient on its own, since Iran maintained enough capability to keep attacking shipping well into the summer. What changed by mid-July was a shift toward a much more surgical, comprehensive strike package aimed specifically at the integrated system Iran relies on to actually enforce a blockade in real time. Its radar to see incoming traffic, its command and control networks to coordinate a response, its anti-ship missiles and small boats to actually carry out an attack, and its broader air defense to protect all of that infrastructure from being hit in the first place. Destroying that entire integrated chain in one coordinated operation, rather than picking off individual boats or missile sites piecemeal over months, appears to be exactly what produced the 11-0 collapse in Iranian naval presence that CENTCOM described. That's a meaningfully different, more effective approach than simply grinding down Iran's numbers one strike at a time, and it likely explains why this specific mid-July operation gets singled out as the moment things genuinely shifted, rather than being just one more entry in a long list of strikes stretching back to March. There's also a psychological dimension to this worth considering, because military campaigns like this one aren't purely about physical destruction. They're also about shaping the other side's confidence in decision-making. An Iranian naval command that watched its own coastal radar, command networks, and small boat fleet get dismantled within the same operational window, going from 11 ships in a key waterway to 0 within 48 hours, is a command that has to seriously reconsider whether attempting to maintain an active blockade posture is even sustainable anymore, regardless of what its public statements continue to claim. That's likely part of why Iran's public rhetoric since this operation has leaned so heavily on defiant, absolute language, insisting the strait remains our territory, and that closure decisions rest entirely with top leadership, rather than being dictated by American military pressure. When your actual physical capability to enforce a position has just been dramatically degraded, doubling down on maximalist rhetorical claims of control is often exactly what you'd expect to see, precisely because it's one of the few tools still fully available. There's also a broader lesson here about how this entire war has actually been fought, one that extends well beyond just this single waterway. Time and again throughout this conflict, the pattern has repeated itself. Iran builds up a dispersed, resilient capability designed to survive sustained pressure. The United States and its allies identify the specific integrated system holding that capability together, and a concentrated strike aimed at the connective tissue of that system, rather than at its individual pieces one at a time, produces results far more dramatic than months of grinding incremental pressure ever managed to achieve. That's exactly what happened with Iran's ballistic missile and drone infrastructure earlier in this war, and it's exactly what appears to have happened here with the naval and coastal defense network protecting the blockade of Hormuz. The lesson worth carrying forward isn't just that American strike packages have gotten more effective as this war has dragged on. It's that Iran's entire defensive strategy across multiple domains has consistently proven more vulnerable to concentrated, systems-level strikes than to the kind of slow, attritional pressure that defined the earliest months of this conflict. So where does that leave the overall picture of whether Hormuz is actually meaningfully open right now? The honest answer sits somewhere between CENTCOM's confident public statistics and Iran's continued defiant statements, and understanding both sides of that gap is more useful than picking one narrative and discarding the other entirely. Real, substantial commercial traffic is moving through the strait at a scale that would have been unthinkable during the worst months of this crisis, when the waterway was functionally closed and shipping firms had suspended operations there almost entirely. That traffic is moving specifically because the United States carried out a targeted, comprehensive military operation that dismantled the integrated system Iran had built to enforce its blockade, catching Iranian naval forces in the Gulf of Oman badly unprepared for just how fast and how comprehensive that specific strike package would be. At the same time, Iran has not surrendered its underlying claim to control over the waterway, has not fully abandoned its willingness to strike vessels that deviate from the sanctioned safe corridor, and continues to describe the strait's supposed closure in the same absolute, defiant language it's used since the earliest days of this crisis, regardless of how much actual capability now backs that rhetoric up. That gap between rhetoric and reality is exactly the space this conflict is likely to keep operating in for the foreseeable future. The United States has proven it can, when it commits to a coordinated enough operation, dramatically degrade Iran's ability to physically enforce a blockade in a matter of days rather than months. But proving that capability once doesn't automatically mean the threat has been permanently eliminated, especially given how quickly Iran has demonstrated, throughout this entire war, an ability to rebuild, disperse, and reconstitute degraded capabilities using new tactics, once the immediate pressure shifts elsewhere. The real test of whether Hormuz stays genuinely open isn't just what CENTCOM's statistics show this week. It's whether Iran's coastal radar, command networks, and small boat fleet stay degraded over the coming months, or whether, like so much of Iran's dispersed military infrastructure elsewhere in this war, it manages to quietly regenerate enough capability to force another round of exactly the same cycle: American pressure, temporary Iranian collapse, defiant Iranian rhetoric, and eventually renewed attacks on shipping that forced the United States back into another full-scale operation to reopen the waterway all over again. And that uncertainty is really the honest note to end on, because it's tempting, watching a statistic like 800 ships and 400 million barrels, to treat this as a closed chapter, a clean military success story with a tidy before and after. But this war has offered plenty of examples of exactly this kind of apparent turning point being followed, weeks or months later by a fresh round of exactly the same fighting once Iran found a new angle or a new gap to exploit. The mid-July operation against Iran's coastal defenses was real, it was measurable, and it clearly caught the IRGC's naval command off guard in a way that few individual strikes in this conflict have managed to do. Whether it holds is a separate question entirely, and it's one that will only get answered by watching what happens over the next several months, not by taking either CENTCOM's statistics or Iran's defiant statements as the final word on their own. So here's what I want to know from you. Do you think this mid-July operation represents a genuine, lasting turning point that keeps Hormuz functionally open going forward? Or do you think Iran's continued insistence on controlling the strait means this cycle of strikes, temporary reopening, and renewed Iranian attacks is going to keep repeating itself for months to come? Drop your take in the comments, because the gap between CENTCOM's numbers and Iran's rhetoric is exactly the kind of thing worth digging into together, and it's the sort of question where the honest answer probably won't be clear for several more months yet. If this breakdown helped make sense of how the US actually pulled off catching Iran's naval forces this unprepared, go ahead and hit that like button, share it with someone who's been following the daily strike headlines, but hasn't seen the full arc of how this specific operation came together, from the opening decapitation strike back in February, all the way through the 11-0 collapse in July, and subscribe, so you're here the moment we find out whether this reopening actually holds.